There's an old saying in SF, never walk a trail or you'll die. And I believe that, man. I broke more jungle in Vietnam than monkeys. We flew right over a village going in, and I went, oh shit. And we got on the ground and we were compromised. They started shooting rifles, trackers. So I moved up this hill and there were just trails everywhere. My tail gunner come over and that meant VC. And I looked up the hill and there's 5 of them coming down the trail. And I went, let them go. One of my people started shooting at me, shit broke loose. And to see, of course, my people's eyes are this big, and mine were getting that big. So finally, after 3 hours, they got me out. The helicopter I was on, we made it back to Dock Toe, and it was so shot up they couldn't fly it anymore. And that was my first mission.
Officially formed in January of 1964 during the Vietnam War, MACV-SOG was a highly classified, multi-service special operations unit that required a mastery of unconventional warfare. The unit was formed to fight in what became known as the Secret War. The enemy wasn't playing by the rules. For example, they would cross borders and operate into countries Americans couldn't enter. If the NVA wanted to move several divisions into a different part of Vietnam, it might be easier and safer to simply move troops into Laos, covering as much distance as possible before re-entering Vietnam on various missions. Of course, tracking major enemy troop movements is vital to any sort of military success, so MACV-SOG would have to be called in to locate these units when necessary.
MACV-SOG consisted of different programs, but what we did was strategic reconnaissance. Across of course, into Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, and up on the Burmese border, we ran some operations.
President Kennedy decided that they didn't want the CIA or other government agencies working on the eastern part of Laos or Cambodia. And they put together the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which went into effect January 1964. And that was the auspices under which they established the Secret War.
One can imagine the danger of operating that deep behind enemy lines with the equipment on your back and only a handful of men at your side. MACV-SOG wound up becoming one of the most dangerous jobs in the Vietnam War.
Well, part of the reason was because it was cross-border. We were in areas that was not approved for ground troops to be in. I mean, they were bombing the shit out of it, but they weren't supposed to put any ground troops in. It was part of a treaty that they'd made to what they called CETO in those days.
The teams began to form in the early days of 65 and 66. Some of the Green Beret teams would just literally walk across the border into Cambodia or into Laos. And they began training up at an A camp called Camp Duck. It continued to build from that point on.
So when I got to Nam, at 5th Group headquarters was the headquarters for the special forces. They brought all of us guys in. They had the Drawer 22 deal, and most of us were senior NCOs. I was a staff sergeant. And the first thing they told us when we got in the room was, well, we're going to open up this map and we're going to show you what you do, but you got to sign a non-disclosure statement.
We all signed a 20-year NDA, non-disclosure agreement forms, so we couldn't talk about the operation for 20 years.
So anyhow, we signed these non-disclosure statements, and they opened up the map. They said, well, you're going to be running strategic reconnaissance in Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam. And like a stupid jarhead that I'd been, I didn't know how to say no, and I ended up in Da Nang.
Typically operating in 2 to 10-man teams, these Green Berets fully integrated with the indigenous South Vietnamese volunteers. A typical MACV-SOG patrol consisted of at least 2 American MACV-SOG operators plus several South Vietnamese soldiers, and they would go wherever the NBA could be found.
Well, the missions were everything from the very general an area reconnaissance, where you'd be inserted, get to high ground, oversee what was going on, take pictures, any intel we could learn about any enemy troop movement, to a point mission, which would be to go in to blow up they began running fuel lines south from Hanoi, south into the DMZ area, and then west into Laos. So a point mission would be to go in and blow that up. Then we did wiretaps, and the CIA told us anytime you see an enemy phone line, tap it.
A lot of their training was conducted in country. These men were learning how to fight a kind of war that hadn't been fought before, and they were forced to learn the hard way.
When you weren't, having the target for them, they go, you better be training. And I'm a real emphatic about that, we always train. Of course, every time you run a mission, you find out something else you need to do. It was OJT out there. If you could last long enough, you could be proficient, but the deal was last long enough.
And that other missions would be a bright light, which was the most dangerous of our missions, where if a team or a pilot was down, we had to go in and get him out or help him out. And so we just carried a lot of extra ammo, hand grenades, bandages, body bags, and a canteen of water, no food. Then a couple others would be, of course, a POW snatch. The best source of intel is a POW.
I always had this thing, I'd get ready for what we call rest overnight. And as soon as it got dark, I'd move. Because I figured they'd be, homing in on me. Of course, you didn't sleep, you just pinwheeled together and put claymores out and hope you survived the night.
MACV-SOG was heavily focused on stealth, and a good mission meant they remained undiscovered. Sometimes they would drop a team as small as 2 men into the jungle for a recon mission, and they often didn't have the option to call for help.
Our whole mission was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail system. Hell, if I moved a click a day, I was running. We'd stop and listen. And they were there to move, logistics and troops down to go into South Vietnam. And so all their security and stuff and their AA, had a lot of AAA, was on the trail system. So once you got close to there, boy, you get ready, you're on rock and roll, and you're snooping and pooping.
Their saving grace, a lot of on-the-job training, and when possible, American firepower from the air.
My first major battle, we were trying to get to an American POW base. We wanted to get in and see if we could free the Americans. And when we went up this trail, at one point we looked back, we could see the NVA, 2 NVA, on the trail, holding their AK-47s, and they were smiling, looking at us. We got off the trail, went straight up a mountain, and we got to a little knoll. As they came up the mountain, Pep and Sal opened fire, and we were engaged in a firefight for 4 hours.
They tried to herd you into ambushes, into horseshoe ambushes. And they do it, by like driving cattle, but once they knew you were there, you were compromised. I always had a philosophy, if I'm compromised, the only 2 things I can do, die here or die later, because they're going to kill you. And lots of times they just kept you alive so they could shoot down the helicopters coming in to get you.
And last night, the South Vietnamese King Bee, the H-34, came in and hovered because he couldn't land. Hovered for 10 minutes waiting for us to get to it. We finally got to it, lifted off, and at that point I was down to my last magazine, my last hand grenade, and he got us out of there at the very last night. And he came back a couple of days, we bought him a drink, and he had 48 holes in that helicopter, but none of our people were hit. Just amazing. So that was welcome to the Secret War.
And part of it too was they used us as bait. They even admitted it after action reports years later that they sent the recon teams not in there to gain information, but to gain enemy contact where they could put air in them. It was a situation that you had to be smart about. John Wayne wouldn't last a day in SOG.
And of course, like now, we couldn't talk for 20 years. When you come home and my little brother or sister or mom and dad, they're saying, "What'd you do?" Well, we were really busy, Mom. Pass the peas. You couldn't talk.
I don't believe in luck. I think luck's due to training. But you can also be unlucky. The people I served with and stuff, like guys like Tilt, and younger guys we had were all gun-ho, ship-watch, good guys. But we had very poor leadership.
Well, to this day, every man I meet, I judge compared to the Green Berets I served with in FOB 1 and CCN. Incredible men. Any virtue that's American, they epitomized it. And in terms of my indigenous troops, we were so tight. It was just an amazing relationship. And the hardest thing for me was, particularly after my second tour of duty, when I left, I knew my time in the Army was up. I was going back to the States, and the guys were still stuck there. They were stuck with that war. The night before I left, we had a big party. Everybody got drunk. So one by one, all the team members passed out. The last guy standing was Hep, my interpreter. He goes, "My, you need anything else?" And I go, "No." He literally passed out on front of the team room in the sand. So I picked him up, I dusted him off, I put him in bed, and I stood there. I'll never forget it. I'll take it to my grave. I stood there, looked at the team. I'm alive after 19 months of running missions with these guys. They're staying to fight. And the NVA's tactics are getting more severe, more successful, and I was leaving to go back. I felt, I felt really bad about that. Then along comes April '75.
Out of the, approximately 600 people who served in that time in recon units and hatchet forces, what we call platoon size operations, there were 9 Medal of Honors and 23 DSCs given. And that's being, you're running around eyewitness statement bullshit. There's none of that going on. I mean, it wasn't a place to go get medals. It was a good place you carry a body bag. You got so paranoid, you didn't want to make friends and stuff like that. But war's hell, but actual combat's a must.